Hello, you are listening to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and politics from an esoteric lens. My name is Andy, and I'll be your host. To support the show and receive bonus content, click the link in the show notes to subscribe. You can also support the show by leaving a 5-star review, by subscribing in your favorite podcast feed and on Substack, and by sharing the show with others who might be interested. Enjoy the show. A long, long time ago, in ancient Europe, before there was even writing, in the prehistory of the West, there was widespread worship of a goddess. The goddess, the Great Mother, the Queen of Heaven and Earth, who gave birth to all that is. This is the story of how what was once seen as sacred has come to be not just desacralized, but derided, seen to be non-existent, not even real, certainly not something to revere or worship. This is the story of the West. I don't think we can understand our current moment without understanding the myths and stories that structure our consciousness. Many people think that myth doesn't matter, right? Myth is mere fiction. It's not real, it's not true, it's made up, it's incidental. But then psychologically, myth is just unconscious. When we take that perspective, we just remain unconscious of the myths that structure the way we think. We can't escape psychology, right? We're psychological beings. And I think just as in some ways on a cultural level, we're still catching up to the quantum revolution, I think we're still also catching up to the psychological revolution, to the recognition that we can't escape our psychology, right? That all of our thinking, even, scientific thought or nonfiction, right? Literal thinking, all of that, of course, is still colored by and created by our psychology. And, the depth psychologists have done so much work over the last century around showing to what extent our mind is structured by these deep myths and stories. So I want to try as much as I can to take a really broad perspective here and do my best to try and tell a story of a history of the West, of how we've gotten into this mess by tracing myths of the goddess and goddesses and God and gods, and how these myths have structured consciousness over time, and how these myths have changed over time. This obviously is a huge subject area and is even more than normal kind of out of my domain. So in this episode, I'm really relying a lot on one book, which is The Myth of the Goddess by Anne Baring and Jules Cashford. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. It's a dense book. It's 700 pages. So I acknowledge that this story I'm going to tell today is one perspective, but I think even if there are parts of the story that might be contested, I think there's still a lot here that's really interesting and relevant. So in a way, I'm trying to digest this one book, The Myth of the Goddess, and I'm inviting you along for the ride. So our story begins many thousands of years ago in the Paleolithic Age, between 30,000 to 15,000 BC, just after the last ice age, as the glaciers were receding from what we call now Europe, revealing grasslands, and then over time, forests. And there's archaeological evidence of widespread goddess worship from this time. And of course, we don't have any writing from this time because this is before there was writing, but there have been many figurines and carvings in rocks of goddess figures, of women. For instance, there's a figure called the Goddess of Losel, carved into rock, discovered in France, dated from 22,000 to 18,000 BC. And she has large hips, a large belly, large breasts. She's holding a horn in the shape of a crescent moon, which has 13 notches, which is both the number of days between the new and full moon, as well as the number of lunar months in a year. Her other hand is resting on her large belly, and she's looking up towards the sky. And the symbolism of women, of the moon, the lunar cycle, as well as horns, are all symbols that continue into more recent cultures and into the period when there's writing and myth, and are specifically associated with goddesses in later myths. Given that what we know from ancient cultures that are, more recent, from when there is evidence of writing and mythology, it wouldn't really make sense to interpret these sculptures as anything but goddesses. Archaeologically, there's this continuity of this symbology into the Neolithic Age. In this period of Neolithic Old Europe, now there's some 30,000 of these sculptures. And we start to see evidence of some gods starting to appear as well, some masculine figures. Oftentimes, the male figure is a child, so the son of the goddess. And there's a few examples of the god and the goddess together. It appears there was this culture of Old Europe, let's say, that was relatively undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. And then in approximately 4,500 BC, there starts to be evidence of mass violence, mass displacement, violent raids, violence on a much larger scale than there appears to be before this time. After this period of many waves of incoming violent tribes, basically, the nomadic tribes that come into this area appear to worship sky gods, masculine gods. Lunar symbology is replaced by solar symbology. This isn't to say that somehow, Europe is pure and flawless or something, and there was this invasion from some external culture. This is all the history of Europe, of the West, the ancient prehistory of the West. So we have inherited both the lunar, feminine, earth, goddess culture and the warring, tribal, masculine, solar, sky god culture. And there's a way of understanding our Western cultural inheritance as an uncomfortable mixture somehow of these two different cultures. So, I'm interested in this story of the West because I'm interested in understanding how we got to where we are. This period of unrest, of invasions and war and displacement marks the beginning of the Bronze Age, named, of course, for the invention of bronze, an ally of copper and tin, which was used to create tools, including weapons. The Bronze Age is also when we see the first evidence of writing. In the middle of the 4th millennium BC, in Mesopotamia, we see the evolution now of city-states. So before that, people lived in small villages. But over this period where violence becomes much more common, human culture becomes in a way more centralized. And we see city-states with walls around them, right? Fortification. And these city-states were governed by kings. Joseph Campbell says in Mesopotamia, about the middle of the 4th millennium BC, we see a rise of a constellation of city-states governed by kings according to a notion of cosmic order and law derived from a long-continued systematic observation of the heavens. Towering temples, symbolic of a new image of the universe, made their appearance at that time. The first examples of monumental architecture in the history of civilization, and it was within the precincts of those sanctuaries that the members of a new type of highly specialized, heavenward gazing priesthood invented about 3200 BC writing, mathematical notation, and the beginnings of a true science of exact astronomical observation. This life-transfiguring concept of a celestial-based political and social order reached Egypt in about 2850 BC with the founding of the first dynasty. Crete on one hand, India on the other in about 2500 BC. Anne Baring and Jules Cashford, in their book, The Myth of the Goddess, write, toward the middle of the Bronze Age, the mother goddess recedes into the background as father gods begin to move to the center of the stage. Sumeria and Egypt provide the first record of the myth of the separation between earth and heaven that was to become the foundation of Iron Age theologies. The emphasis is no longer on creation emerging from a mother goddess, but on a god separating his parents and so initiating the process of creation. So, in other words, mythically, reality, like earth, material reality, existence, was seen as analogous to or mythically akin to the mystery of birth. Creation was seen as created in the way that humans are born. But in this period, in the transition from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, myths start to conceive of existence as being made, not created or born, but made by gods, by masculine gods. So from Baring and Cashford again, the earliest Sumerian creation myth tells the story of Namu, goddess of the primordial waters, who brought forth the cosmic mountain An-Ki, heaven and earth. An and Ki brought forth a son, Enlil, god of air or breath, who separated heaven from earth and carried off earth, his mother, to be his bride. So this is now a quote from that myth. The Lord whose decisions are unalterable, Enlil, who brings up the seed of the land from the earth, took care to move away heaven from earth, took care to move away earth from heaven. So mythically now, earth and heaven are becoming separate. And so again, from Baring and Cashford, With the appearance of Enlil, creation is no longer imagined as a birth from the mother, but as the word that speaks all things into being. So again, quoting the mythology, your word, it is plants. Your word, it is grain. Your word is the flood water, the life of all the lands. Baring and Cashford say later, it seems that in early Sumeria, as in early Egypt and Crete, women played a public role in society, particularly the priestesses. They owned property, transacted business, and their interests were protected in the law courts. Sisters and brothers inherited property on equal terms from the family estate. Daughters who married took a dowry with them, which they kept in the event of a divorce. In the centuries after 2300 BC, the status of women in Sumerian society deteriorated. Although they still owned property, their husbands had to be consulted before buying and selling. Concurrently with these changes, the female deities in the Sumerian pantheon also lost their former position. This cultural shift also marks a transition from all of creation seen as a unity and as sacred into multiple binaries or separations. The separation between light and dark, where darkness starts to be associated with the bad or with eventually evil, rather than with lunar mythology. We also start to see evidence of ritual sacrifice during this period. At the same time, we see the continuity of imagery of the mother goddess into ancient myth. So as Inanna Ishtar in Mesopotamia, known as the goddess of the great above and the great below, Isis in Egypt, queen of heaven and earth, and eventually, of course, the many goddesses of ancient Greece. So interestingly, there was this long period of violence and disruption and invasion and displacement for thousands of years. But areas of Greece like Crete, which is an island, seem to have been not so affected by this influx of violent cultures. And goddess imagery and mythology is more prevalent in that area. Now, all of these goddesses are often depicted with the same symbology that we see in prehistory many thousands of years earlier. So the serpent, the tree of life, the crescent moon, as well as the spiral and the labyrinth are also symbols of the goddess. Now, interestingly, we don't just have to infer this massive shift in mythology. The shift itself is depicted in mythology, which is so interesting. So in particular, in the myth of Tiamat, which comes from Babylon in the Iron Age, which began approximately 1250 BC. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, tells the story of Tiamat, a goddess, who gives birth to the first generation of deities who were fathered by Apsu, both understood as water. Apsu, apparently annoyed by all the noise that the children are making, seeks to kill them, seeks to kill their children. So this is from the myth. When the heights of heaven and the earth beneath had not been named, and when Apsu, their father, the waters that fell from heaven, and the sweet river waters, and Tiamat, their mother, the salt waters of the sea, still mingled their waters, when no field or marsh was formed and no gods had been called into being, then were the great gods created within the primal pair. The first gods were Lamu and Lahamu, and then Anshar and Kishar were created. And then Anu and Ea. But these new generations of gods disturbed Apsu with their clamor, and he consulted his minister, Mumu. Together they went to Tiamat to tell her of their decision to destroy them, so that once again there could be peace and quiet. Tiamat protested at their plan. "Why destroy what we ourselves have brought into being?" she cried. But Mumu counseled Apsu to proceed, and together they plotted the downfall of the younger gods. Now, as the story goes, the younger gods became aware of this plan to destroy them. And so Ea killed Apsu and took Mumu prisoner. And then together, Ea and his wife give birth to Marduk. Tiamat gets angry and gives birth to monsters, to serpent monsters. The myth says of Marduk, his figure was enticing, flashing the look of his eyes, manly, his going forth. He was a leader from the start, and when Ea, his father, beheld him, he rejoiced and bestowed on him double equality with the gods. Marduk was exalted beyond them in all ways, and all his members marvelously arranged, incomprehensible and difficult to look at. He had 4 eyes and as many ears, and when his lips moved, fire blazed forth. Each of the ears grew large, each of the eyes also, to see all. He was prodigious and was clothed with the radiance of 10 gods, with the majesty to inspire fear. The gods crowned Marduk and said, "We give thee sovereignty over the whole world. Thy weapon shall never lose its power. It shall crush thy foe." They called Marduk king and set out to destroy Tiamat. The Lord spread out his net to enfold her. The evil wind, which followed behind, he let loose in her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove in the evil wind that she closed not her lips. As the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended and her mouth was wide open. He released the arrow, it tore her belly, it cut through her insides, splitting her heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. He cast down her carcass to stand upon it. The Lord trod on the legs of Tiamat. With his unsparing mace he crushed her skull. When the arteries of her blood he had severed, the north wind bore it to places undisclosed. On seeing this, his fathers were joyful and jubilant. They brought gifts of homage to him. Then the Lord paused to view her dead body, that he might divide the monster and do artful works. He split her like a shellfish into 2 parts. Half of her he set up and sealed it as sky. He heaped up a mountain over Tiamat's head, pierced her eyes to form the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, and heaped similar mountains over her dugs, which he pierced to make the rivers from the eastern mountains that flow into the Tigris. Her tail he bent up into the sky to make the Milky Way, and her crotch he used to support the sky. Opening her mouth, he addressed Ea, his father, to impart the plan he had conceived in his heart. "Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Verily, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." Ea answered him, speaking a word to him, giving him another plan for the relief of the gods. "Let one of their brothers, the defeated gods, be handed over. He alone shall perish, that mankind may be fashioned out of blood. Let him be handed over who contrived the uprising. His guilt will I make him bear." And then later, they bound him, Kingu. Holding him before Ea, they imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood vessels. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. So we have now an epic of creation that tells the story of the great mother goddess being killed by one of her grandsons, dismembered, and creation itself as being formed from her dismembered body. And so again, from Baring and Cashford, they say, this epic of the conquest of the primordial mother goddess by the sky, wind, and sun god Marduk coincides with the final stage of the Sumero-Babylonian civilization, which was marked by the decline of its culture and an ever-increasing emphasis on war and conquest, leading to the growth of an empire. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk, who describes himself as the son of Ea, god of wisdom, is set up as the new ruler of the gods, which effectively symbolizes the transfer of power from the old Sumerian mother kingdom to the new Babylonian kingdom of the son, who becomes the father. It certainly registers the final end of the earlier cultural phase in which the religion of the mother goddess prevailed. The primordial mother goddess, known as Namu or Ninmah, whose image in Sumeria was both the sea and a great serpent, has now become Tiamat, the demoness mother. The defeat of Tiamat may have served to discredit the Sumerian motherland, which is now portrayed as threatening and evil in the image of a dragon worthy of destruction. Marduk takes the tablets of the law from Tiamat, and this may signify the transfer of political control from Sumeria to Babylonia, and of religious power from the mother goddess to the young god. Fragments of other creation myths exist in which the creation of the world and humanity is not associated with the death of a dragon, and takes place by the act of a goddess, or a goddess and a god, or by all the goddesses and gods acting in concert, which is to say, this myth of the killing of the mother goddess is not the only myth. I really like the way that Sophie Strand talks about mythology as mycelial, especially in oral cultures, right? There were many, many, many different myths. And what we receive through history, through writing, must be understood as, simply the official version of mythology, but it certainly wasn't the only version. I don't think that we can see writing in the absence of an understanding of power. As soon as something is written down, like written in stone, literally, it's official, it's sanctioned. It's part of the empire, right? Especially in these times, not anyone could write or had the tools to write or the ability to read, right? So what we receive through history, through what has been written down, can't be understood in the absence of an understanding of power. So many scholars have noted that this mythological context was very relevant and important in the beginnings of Judaism and the writing of the Old Testament, or the gathering of writings into the Old Testament. And the scholar William Dever also speaks of this period of the gathering of writings into the Old Testament as necessarily influenced by power and propaganda. So in his book, Did God Have a Wife? Which is, I think it's telling how almost strange that title might read, right? We're so accustomed to not thinking of God as having a wife. But in this book, he takes especially archaeological approach to this period of ancient Judaism And when this culture is understood not just through the Bible, but through also the wider context of archaeology, the picture we get of this culture is very, very different from the one that we get from the Bible. The archaeological record clearly shows a continuity between this ancient culture of goddess worship into ancient Israel around the time that the Old Testament was being written. Just as there have been many goddess figurines discovered from many thousands of years before that, there have also been many goddess figurines discovered in ancient Israel around this time. So there's a distinction between the religion of the Bible, right, the official sanctioned doctrine, and what was very likely the actual culture of that period and of those people. Devers argues that what we can understand as the folk religion of that time wasn't just practiced by women, but also by men. It was, the mythology of the people. And the fact that there's, in the Old Testament, certain activities that are prohibited suggests that these were common, right? And that the empire, in a way, the powers that be, were, seeking to control the beliefs and the culture. So the following activities were prohibited: frequenting local shrines, setting up standing stones, making images of various deities, venerating the goddesses, burning incense, baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, making vows, performing rituals having to do with childbirth and children, engaging in astral and solar worship, divining and magic except by priests, and so on. So Devers says their inclusion implies that the majority of people, not just an easily ignored minority, were doing these practices. So the gathering of scriptures into the Old Testament, right, the official canonical religion, represents the transition from polytheism to monotheism, which was not just an organic transition, but was imposed. So polytheism was part of ancient Israel. So given these many, many figurines that have been discovered from this period in this area, William Dever makes the argument that very likely these figurines were of the goddess Asherah, and that in the folk mythology, she may have actually been seen as God's wife. Devers writes, many previous scholars have identified the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah as Ishtar, or as she was more commonly known in the West, Ashtart. Notably, Ackerman, in her definitive study of late Judean and exilic folk religion. Ashtart is the name of one of the 3 Canaanite female deities, alongside Asherah and Anat. Ackerman has argued persuasively that a mass of linguistic evidence from the 2nd and 1st millennia BC identifies Ashtart as a heavenly queen and divine consort. In later Phoenician and Greek sources, she becomes Aphrodite, goddess of sex and love. The most intriguing aspect of all this is the probability that the Queen of Heaven in the 2 passages in Jeremiah can be identified specifically as Ashtart, that is, as another Canaanite mother goddess venerated in folk religion in late Judean times. Devers points to the work of his teacher, Frank Cross, and several of his students, who have argued that the 3 great goddesses of Ugarit, Asherah, Anat, and Ashtart, are all in effect hypostatizations of the cosmic great mother goddess of Canaan, all playing the same role, but each perhaps venerated in a particular local manifestation, tradition, and cult. Thus, women in ancient Israel were probably addressing their special concerns to the Great Mother of Canaan, who lived on in the Iron Age, whether they knew her as Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, or Ishtar, or Ashtart. I think that most conceived of her as a consort of the male deity Yahweh, but others may have seen her as more simply a personification of Yahweh's more feminine attributes. So, of course, despite this imposition of monotheism, goddesses and symbols of the goddess and the feminine just keep cropping up, right? So in Gnosticism, for example, in the image of Sophia and the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, the sacred union, as well as over and over again through the image and worship of Mother Mary. So it's as if the feminine principle can't be suppressed. There's sort of a psychological need for an understanding of both the masculine and the feminine. We see the same themes also echoed in the evolution of Greek culture, where the goddess survived for longer than in other areas because it was protected from the influence of the violent raids coming in over the course of thousands of years. But even in Greek culture, we see this transition from great mother gods into the goddess as having a more prescribed role and as being made rather than born. So Venus or Aphrodite, for example, was in early Greek culture seen as, again, the queen of heaven, but over time comes to be regarded as a goddess presiding over a very specific realm: beauty, love, sex, right? So from the great mother goddess to something very specific and narrow. There's also a split in later Greek culture between two different versions of Aphrodite. One who is seen as higher and revered by philosophers, Aphrodite Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, born from the sea, from the sea foam after Kronos castrates Uranus. So this higher version of Aphrodite is born of gods, of masculine gods, whereas the Aphrodite Pandemos of the people is born of the union between a god and a goddess. We also see Athena, goddess of wisdom, as born from the forehead of Zeus. So it's interesting, both these goddesses are seen as born of a god, not of the union of a god and a goddess, or not of, being birthed of a woman. So here too, we have this prioritizing of the masculine, of the intellectual, of the mind, and a desacralization of nature, of creation. So, of course, also very important in this story is the story of Adam and Eve. And again, we see the continuity of symbolism from these previous goddess worshipping cultures into the story of Adam and Eve. So the connection between the goddess or the feminine and the tree of life and the serpent and the garden, which might be understood to represent creation itself. So this story has been used time and time again as reason to suppress the feminine and to suppress women and to prove that women are lesser than and subordinate to men. So, we see essentially patriarchal logic depicted in mythological form in the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam is created in God's image. Eve then is made second from Adam, right? From one of his ribs. So she's not born, she's made. And Baring and Cashford emphasize that even though Jesus, in the Gospels doesn't refer to original sin or equate sexuality with sinfulness, these ideas are foundational in Christianity, especially through the influence of Paul and Augustine. So again, we have to understand a distinction between official doctrine, right? Religion from the Bible, and what was very likely the actual practice of religion at the time. And, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that early Christians practiced and believed in a way that was quite different from the Christianity of the Bible, right? Paul's Christianity. So, okay, back to the story of Adam and Eve. Of course, she's the cause for the fall, right? She tempts Adam with the apple. And so the fall of humanity is her fault. Because of Eve tempting Adam, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. The first murder happens. There's shame, right? They clothe themselves, and sin is born. Baring and Cashford write, the story of Eve is in part the story of the displacing of the mother goddess by the father god. Both Eve's name, Hawa, and Yahweh's are taken from a form of the Hebrew verb to be, pointing to a common derivation. The meaning of her name is then life, or she who gives life, as Adam's subsequent naming of her as the mother of all living registers. The figure of Eve is still transparent to her former role, so that her deposition from mother goddess to human woman, from creator to created, can be clearly seen through the images. Demythologizing a goddess is a subtle process whereby the numinosity that once belonged to her is withdrawn and clothes another figure, in this case Yahweh. By contrast, Eve becomes the opposite of what she was, not a giver of life, but a cause of death. Insofar as she was formerly also creation or nature herself, this demythologizing process extends to the whole of nature, which becomes, like her, fallen and cursed. And later they write, John Phillips, in his book, Eve, The History of an Idea, sums up, the history of Eve begins with the appearance of Yahweh in the place of the mother of all the living. This shift of power marks a fundamental change in the relationship between humanity and God, the world and God, the world and humanity, and men and women. What it involved, ultimately, Phillips concludes, was the rejection of the feminine as a sacred entity. Baring and Cashford connect this story of Adam and Eve and the continuous use of it over the course of 2,000 years as a justification for the suppression of the feminine principle as well as women. They connect it directly to our attitudes towards nature, including science. So they write about the use of this myth, that it affects our present attitudes towards nature and the body of earth. There has never been in Christianity, as there was in the goddess cultures, an understanding of the earth as a living being, still less an awareness that everything was holy. since belief in divine immanence was doctrinally dismissed as belief in spirits. The goddesses and gods of pagan cultures were thought of as demons, and the values expressed through them were regarded as demonic. But this conflicts with the teachings of Jesus, who does speak about nature as sacred. Nonetheless, if nature is not believed to be intrinsically divine and instead is only made by the deity as something separate from the whole, and if the physical process of birth and begetting are experienced as a transmission of sin from generation to generation, then it is hardly surprising if they are eventually regarded as mechanistic. Consequently, nature has been progressively desacralized from Augustine through Aquinas to the development of science from the 16th century to the present day. It was Francis Bacon who said that nature should be hounded in her wandering, bound into service, made a slave. Borrowing the language of the Inquisition, nature was to be put in constraint, and the aim of the scientist was to torture her secrets from her. Descartes also wrote that humanity's ultimate purpose was to become the lords and masters of nature. Such language would be inconceivable in a culture that believed in divine immanence. So we have this long, slow, mythic transition from a perspective which reveres nature as created, right, as a mystery of creation, as birthed from the great mother goddess, to a vision in which nature is seen as diametrically opposed to or completely severed from the logos, the mind, the God, the masculine God, which is transcendent and not immanent, right? Not in nature. So nature itself is no longer seen as sacred. Nature itself is seen as fallen, as sinful. And the divine is seen as something wholly other, outside of this world. And, as much as most people now, scientific, intellectual people might think that these myths have no bearing on the way we think, I think psychologically it doesn't work that way. And it's so interesting that I think we still see this influence of this idea that the transcendent or the intellectual, the logical, the mathematical is higher and above and separate from nature, the body, reality even, right? So we're going to talk about this in the future, about current scientific theories that, how reality is understood. But of course, we still have with us this divide between the mind and the body, between nature and spirit. And this is a perpetual problem that keeps cropping up in philosophy and in science, where it's like, how are we supposed to understand this divide? How do we unite them together? How can there possibly be a divide, right? How could mind be separate from the body? How would they then interact, right? So this deep mythic structure of this divide, which we can understand mythically as the divide between heaven and earth, the divide between the masculine sky god and the feminine earth god, this divide keeps cropping up in our thinking. And people might say that has nothing to do with myth, but I think that's unlikely. So the material world, nature, has always been mythically connected to the feminine, and at one time was revered, and over the course of millennia has been degraded and derided. The word matter, etymologically, has the same roots as the word mother. The word matrix also comes from the same roots as matter and mother. And matrix, originally the word was used to mean womb. And so I think it's so interesting, this popular idea of escaping the matrix and the matrix as being contorted or distorted. And I think that actually there is something to that intuition, to that idea. The matrix as we know it has been contorted and distorted, but the solution isn't to just escape the matrix. We need to understand the true matrix as nature itself, as the feminine principle, as the goddess who gives birth to all that is, to re-sacralize it, to remember that it's divine. It's through this culture of seeing matter as woman, as feminine, as something to be studied and controlled and manipulated, and over the course of centuries to be understood in a very theoretical way, so that now we're in a place where matter is no longer seen as our experiential reality, but as an abstraction, as a matrix in a mathematical sense, as a grid. We now understand nature itself in this grid-like way as something that we can completely understand through science, through physics, where there's no mystery, no numinosity, where it's no longer infinite and mysterious, but finite and abstracted and completely under control. And this is a distortion of the matrix. It is something to extract ourselves from, but not to be done with matrix, to understand the sacred nature of reality itself, which even if you're not interested in spirituality or mythology, how can you not see physical reality? How can you not see that as mysterious, magical, incredible, worthy of respect, if not reverence? I'm going to make the case over the next several episodes that science has been deeply impacted by this mythic structure. And my position absolutely isn't anti-science. I think that the sciences can be helped by recognizing aspects of this mythology and how it has impacted our psychology. And I believe certain problems or conundrums that are cropping up in science can be assisted through a recognition of our broader and deeper psychology, which is often unconscious. But to make that case, there's a lot more to discuss. So just a little hint of where we're headed. We focus today in a way on the story of the demotion of the goddess figure. But I thought we might leave on a different note. While time and again, official doctrine would seek to minimize her influence or demote her position, or even write her out of existence altogether, as we've seen, she keeps cropping up in sources that are not official, right? So esoteric or folk mythology. So I thought I would read one of my favorites, the Thunder perfect mind, which is from the Gnostic Gospels. The thunder, perfect mind. I was sent forth from the power, and I have come to those who reflect upon me, and I have been found among those who seek after me. Look upon me, you who reflect upon me, and you hearers, hear me. You who are waiting for me, take me to yourselves, and do not banish me from your sight, and do not make your voice hate me, nor your hearing. Do not be ignorant of me anywhere or any time. Be on your guard. Do not be ignorant of me. For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. I am she whose wedding is great, and I have not taken a husband. I am the midwife, and she who does not bear. I am the solace of my labor pains. I am the bride and the bridegroom, and it is my husband who begot me. I am the mother of my father, and the sister of my husband, and he is my offspring. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am the voice whose sound is manifold, and the word whose appearance is multiple. I am the utterance of my name. Why have you hated me in your counsels? For I shall be silent among those who are silent, and I shall appear and speak. Why then have you hated me, you Greeks? Because I am a barbarian among the barbarians? For I am the wisdom of the Greeks and the knowledge of the barbarians. I am the one whose image is great in Egypt, and the one who has no image among the barbarians. I am the one who has been hated everywhere, and who has been loved everywhere. I am the one whom they call life, and you have called death. I am the one who they call law, and you have called lawlessness. I am the one whom you have pursued, and I am the one whom you have seized. I am the one whom you have scattered, and you have gathered me together. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. For more content, for more information, go to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, take care.